It is my honor to welcome Lindsay to the community. So Lindsay heads up Egon Zehnder's um, board search practice. So what does that mean? So she works with executives, like members in the cyborg community, as well as CEOs, to help put you onto amazing both public and private company boards. So she works directly with like CEOs and boards of some pretty high profile companies. Um, and I met her a couple months ago at Deb Liu's house because Deb hosted a women in product event for women who were looking to get on and serve on boards. And after Lindsay shared her wisdom with us, I was like, oh, Lindsay, you have to come and speak to our Sidebar community because they would love to hear from you. And she generously agreed to generously share her wisdom with us today. And I had a lovely walk with her last week. And she's in my neighborhood. We learned a lot about each other. She is a wonderful human being on top of being a badass recruiter. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay, share more about herself. And then she has a bunch of content to go through. And then we'll take questions throughout, but then we will have plenty of time at the end as well to answer all of your questions. And I know that you all have a lot. So with that, Lindsay, thank you.
Thank you. That's a very generous introduction, holding the bar high. I'll share a little bit about myself in the context of how I got to doing what I now do and love to do. And then would really love to invite this to be conversational. I do not want to be just presenting, but I did bring some slides that will hopefully be educational and provocative. And then, again, I will invite you to like press the non-mute button and be brave. So with that, yes. So as I mentioned, I'm a managing partner of Egon Zehnder. We are one of the large global private firms that do kind of leadership advisory broadly. So we will, from a board perspective, have the great opportunity to work with boards on multi-year succession planning. So, whether this has been the New York Times or General Mills, right? You can say that, over a period of time, we have placed, 5 to 7 directors at those firms to fill different priorities. And in other cases, we will be brought in to help both smaller companies and or pre-IPO companies bring in new directors. So there's kind of the refreshment piece, which comes with both kind of trends and or events. And then there's also kind of these milestone moments that then trigger the need to bring in independent directors. Our firm does this globally. So I have colleagues in Jakarta and Johannesburg with whom I collaborate. And so we look at the world as one group of humans and one talent pool that we like to move to the right kind of passion and opportunity and application of their skills. I came into this job never imagining being in this job. So I am perfect for this job because that, by definition, I have experienced the serendipity of one's career. And now I have the opportunity and great fortune and responsibility to manifest serendipity for others. So I kind of started my career in New York in the dot-com boom, kind of at JP Morgan Chase. It wasn't JP Morgan Chase at the time, but nonetheless it is today. Then I was in enterprise software. I did strategy consulting. I got my MBA. All of these experiences somehow put me into advising leaders on other leadership choices. So now 15 years at the firm, this is what I do. So, in some circumstances, I would be working on like the Marquettas and the Instacart boards before they went public. And in other instances, I would be placing board directors on Universal Music Group board while Bill Ackman is an activist, right? So it's kind of this broad spectrum. So I can bring perspective from big and small and founder-led and non-founder-led. And again, hopefully you can hit me with questions that meet your own curiosities. But with that introduction, I'll just kind of dive in with a little bit of laying the landscape, if that suits. Is there anything that is most critical, like before I even get into a prepared agenda, that you want to make sure we cover? And I am totally happy to call on people as well. So in my future life, I will hopefully be a professor. That's kind of, my second calling, or maybe my third or fourth. So we'll see if I can practice that today. Okay. All right.
Sorry, before we jump, I had one question. Slow thinking slowly. how does one discover the needs of a particular board at a given point in time?
Yep.
What they're struggling with, what are they looking for?
Yep.
So as to be the right fit.
Yep. Let me actually answer that because you brought it up, and I want to make sure we cover things that are top of mind. There's actually two answers I would offer. One is you can, certainly I can do this with high facility because it's kind of what I'm studied in doing, but you can yourself look at some boards and figure out, or at least hypothesize, is there likely going to be a change in some coming period? So going back to Ha's initial prompt, what is your dream board? If your dream board was, I'm making it up, like Best Buy, okay, maybe that's a client, maybe that's not the right one. If it was Coca-Cola, you might be able to look at it and say, look, there's a lot of folks there who are nearing the age limit, right? Because that would be in their proxy filings that they might have an age limit. Or there might be directors who've been on the board for nearing 10 years or more. And typically at the 10-year mark, you might expire in your independence. You might say that there's other reasons, right? Kind of macro or otherwise, where you'd say the composition doesn't seem to meet the needs or match the trends of the current. They don't have someone who's, adept at cyber or, strong in technology. So there are ways where you can look at board composition and hypothesize. And in which case, if you saw some clues, right, and it was a company that you were quite keen on, it would be appropriate to reach out to the head of NomGov, who is the person who is appointed to lead the committee that is responsible for hiring and firing the CEO, as well as hiring and firing board members, and say, in a very elegant way, this is why I'm motivated by your board. This is what I can bring. Should you have board openings over the next few years, I would love to be in consideration. And by the way, it may lead to nothing. It may be a dead end.
Sure.
Maybe you go in a long-term pile. Maybe you go nowhere. But those are certainly activities that do happen. And motivation and interest, which we will get to, is important, right? For folks, noting particularly that this is a long-term commitment. And I'll give you a really crazy fact, is that there's some statistic that I read which said in the US, the average board tenure is longer than the average marriage. You're like, wow. And by the way, on both sides of that, that's screwed up, right? Maybe our marriages aren't long enough and maybe our board tenures are too long. You could argue both. I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying, regardless, you can think of these as being very long-term commitments. So if you were to put yourself out there, know what you're getting yourself into. And then secondarily, when there is a search, we'll talk about this in the context of the materials I prepared. Then, how do you probe in terms of what is the motivation for them seeking a new board member, and how then might you think about the contour and context of your own skills and experiences to best, fulfill or not that need.
Got it.
Does that help?
Yep, super helpful. Thank you.
Super. Okay, cool. And by the way, feel free to interrupt or raise your hand or whatever you want to do. This is kind of stuff that you would all know, but basically, there's many factors that are driving, board demand today. As I mentioned, some of it's event-based, like you're going to have an IPO, or there's kind of change in regulation. Other are just trend-based, but disruption, tech, cyber, AI certainly is top of mind for all boards and companies. And so they are asking themselves the question around, do we have the resident expertise to address those challenges and opportunities, right? It's not only playing defense. Diversity and inclusion has been obviously a big part of the standards and expectations for boards. We can talk about how that's kind of waxed and waned. Happy to provide a very candid perspective on that, as well as how ESG fits into that. That's generally it. One other trend that I would say, which goes into traditional business leadership skills, and the last paragraph, there is a very strong demand for CEOs to serve in board capacities, current or former, with high preference for current. And that is because, which, everyone says we're in unprecedented times. This notion of relevancy and having to serve an organization and lead in today's challenges is unique. And so someone who might be kind of a little bit yesteryear and less modern in these issues may be seen as less relevant, pertinent, and therefore compelling. which by the way, there's a short availability for, so it basically creates a disequilibrium in the market. And I can talk about, if it's of interest, kind of where we see disequilibriums, where of course, like the demand is here and the supply is here. And then, how we have to facilitate, bridging the gap of requirements to meet the client demand. So we don't have to get into this, but like an executive search, there are things that, you would be wanting to keep in mind. It is true that as paramount as culture fit is for a leadership role, is very true for a search for a board. And we can talk about, what that might mean, but it would certainly be a prudent, first interview question for you to ask of them. And it looks like this. How do you characterize the culture of the board? And then you could ask, additional questions, how participatory is everyone? Are there dominant voices? What is the rhythm of the meeting? How much of it is scripted versus discussion? How often does management attend? In what capacities do they attend? And you're looking at a lot of different cues there that will help you understand whether that culture fits you and what the expectation of the role is. Because even if the role is the same thing by way of definition on each board, it will manifest in a different way for different boards, right? So some boards literally have like a dog and pony show. Management comes in, it's scripted, Q&A, and then management leaves, right? And it is a performance, right? And in other situations, there's a different expectation for kind of that lower fidelity content exchange to happen before, and for the conversation in the room to be with sharp questions and a higher degree of critical thinking and accountability. And understanding that, again, will help you visualize yourself in that capacity and whether, again, it's the right board. So that's why culture fit's important. You can see all these different ESG, and you can argue, we talked about climate change not being in vogue in today's political context. It is still in vogue for many companies. And so again, kind of what can you bring along the ESG agenda, I think is still critical. And then we can talk about some of the competencies which are critical at the bottom. Let me just characterize these because it is different than the competencies you would expect as an executive. So in an executive role, you're responsible for executing, driving. In a board role, there's this notion around nose in, fingers out. Right? You're like sniffing things, you're curious, but like you're not touching, you're not executing. And it will be a part of every interview where folks are assessing whether you quote unquote get what that fiduciary role is, which means like you're not there to run the business. You're not there to tell people what to do. It's not a directive role, it's a director role, right? And so people will really look for you having the right altitude is one of the frames, right? Which is kind of like, again, looking above, looking at, bringing critical thinking and very smart questioning to the room, right? So, your comments will end more with a question than an exclamation mark. Yeah. The integrity and independence part is, obviously maybe obvious, but a lot of what, even when I'm coaching newer colleagues at Egon Zehnder, I say, you're looking for judgment. Yes, you might be looking for a certain skill, where someone's going to bring a lens or mental metaphors to that boardroom to be accretive to the conversation. But primarily your job as a fiduciary and board member, whether it's a private company, a big company, public company, is that judgment, which is where we mean integrity and independence. The collaboration and influencing, obviously, because that's how decisions are made. An example being, I just ran a contentious chair search for a public company everyone here would know. And we had 3 internal candidates. We had a outgoing chair who was dramatic at best on his exit. And it's not common that you would have a competition amongst 3 directors for the chair. And what I worked very closely with the board on and the head of NomGov, as I was mentioning, is to facilitate a shared agreement on what the outcome would be versus dividing the board on a decision. Right? So again, how are you using your communication skills, your influencing skills, your relational skills, not politics, but to drive insight, alignment, and a very positive disagree and commit. Strategic orientation, of course, goes into like the altitude. Like it's not around, It's not around kind of this level of micro detail. Yes, you need to understand those, but you want to ask the questions around, have you thought of this? Should we consider this? Might this also be of pertinent discovery? Those sort of questions that would guide and direct, you're a director, right? Management to take pause on certain decisions they're making or consider new pathways. And then again, board results orientation, it's so different. So it's just worth pointing out, like you're not there to get the shit done, right? It's in the context of, what you're responsible for. So that's a little bit of, I'll be quiet for a second, but you get the difference. I'm really using this to largely differentiate what an executive is responsible for versus what is the mindset and role of a board director. Yeah? Sandy, we're good? Okay, cool. All right, so you do not need to know all of these details. This is a lot, right? But it is worth knowing that there are points of view that impact how boards evolve and what informs eligibility, right? So there's things called proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis, and think of these as like governing bodies that express a point of view, right? So if you look at the capacity constraints, if you had, more than 4 public company boards, or you were, and this is hypothetical, you were going to be chair of 3 public company boards, ISS would send letters to those boards and say, this is not appropriate. This is too much, right? And what they're trying to do is to say, there should be standards by which, and capacity, while it is a qualitative metric, you don't want 10 people being on all the boards in the US. They're not going to have the capacity and bandwidth to really take on the issues and commit fully to the role. That's not an appropriate way of doing things for a host of reasons. So anyway, just know that ISS and Glass Lewis will be organizations that you would want to know about because they inform some of the rules around composition. And then there are investment managers who run, so much of the institutional funds that also will take stake on certain principles and designs of boards. So for example, as diversity became, certainly more in vogue, okay, that's embarrassing to say, like more in the social conscious of the US in the past 5 years with varying degrees of real commitment. The State Street Advisors, for example, they were like very committed to the female ratio. And so since they, control trillions of dollars in movement, that's what drove a lot of the adherence to bringing on more diverse leaders onto boards. So this is kind of like the influence behind the scenes, but just know that it's not 100% an open market because you do have these influencers that are trying to drive basic parameters of good governance. We good? You don't need to necessarily know the details today, but you do need to know that there are orgs. How do you say your name? Dejant?
Digant.
Digant. Okay, I wasn't
Yeah.
sure. And is it Dave?
Dave, yeah. Mhm.
Okay, that's a fun name.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Where are you from?
I'm in Jersey City, so.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining. Okay, so this is kind of, just way to think about getting on a board. So top of it is, okay, there's external factors that will drive board recruitment, a la the need to call me or to add new people to your board. And then your controlling variables are the 2 bottoms, and we'll talk about this. Your value prop and your role in the process. So that's kind of where I'll dive in. These are all obvious. This is, again, in this, trying to give you a framework of like what to think about here in terms of, what are they, the board's looking at and trying to understand about you. And you should be sharp on all of these things. One is the motivation. And this is going to sound, super, apple pie, and I get it. But my clients will say, but why do they want to join this board? Like, I had a client meeting this morning for a public company in the financial services space. I know you don't want to get on a financial services, but he was saying, questioning the motivations. This is actually a mission-driven business model. It's in the global remittances space. Someone doesn't have to necessarily be a beneficiary of kind of this global monetary exchange, but they need to appreciate how it can change lives and change markets. And so getting into the motivation is critical. There are other reasons why folks might be motivated, and it doesn't have to be a mission-oriented one. When we went around the room, many of you were describing mission-oriented businesses, those that have large-scale impact, health and education, et cetera. But it's really just, okay, where are you? What intrigues you about this? And you need to be sharp because that will be a question. So for example, I'm doing a search right now for Best Buy, $42 billion retailer, right? I don't need someone who's mission-oriented, but I need someone who is intellectually captivated by the transformation that they are architecting, right? So understanding your motivation, being succinct about it, and being honest about it. Otherwise, it's a long-term commitment and it's going to be a waste of your time. What is true about board roles, going back to motivation, is, again, being sincere to yourself. I believe humans have negative time, right? Like you have negative free time. Someone's always trying to grab it. And what happens in board searches, in board service, you're there to, like, when stuff hits the fan, right? When the CEO needs to be fired, when, there's an activist coming in, when you need to hire new board members. Like, these are very material and kind of time-consuming events. It's not all like paper pushing and, rubber stamping. And so you have to, again, make sure that you're motivated to give up a random Saturday when an event might require your attention. So that's how I would think about motivation. Like, that's like your internal test. Attractability, obviously we look at that. And what's so interesting about this, and this is going to sound super tactical, but it is how things work. See, it says there, conflicts of interest, date conflicts, and capacity. One of the first things I will do in a board search, if I think that you are an eligible candidate, is I will do something super tactical and arguably tacky, and I will ask you to quote unquote clear or cross-reference the board calendar. And typically I will give you a board calendar for the next 18 months, if not longer. And what you're then having to do is say, can I make this commitment, right? Or you might say, look, I can't make November, like right now I have a candidate who can't make November of 25, but can make all of fiscal 26. Okay, we can work with that, we know that. I have another candidate on a project right now who lives overseas, and he can only make 3 in person a year. And the board, while he was a priority candidate, said no. Not because they don't think this person's going to be effective in the 75% that they show up, but they don't want to change the precedence, which is the commitment that everyone shows up for all 100% of the 4 in-person meetings. So again, just expect that as part of this step. It's not supposed to be tactical and tacky, but it is kind of just a feasibility hurdle. And if they don't give it to you, you should ask, right? Because another thing is, so I'm doing a board search for a big, $70 billion company in Australia. Well, their calendar, because they have different governance model, like it's a huge commitment, and you have to fly to Australia. So like, I'm looking at people who can take a week out of their lives, and it's not a 4 commitments a year. So again, there might be different models in which kind of the expectation is of your time and capacity. And we all know, like, don't tell people you have capacity when you don't, right? Because it'll disappoint yourself and disappoint others. Performance, this isn't just around, obviously your track record, but, how do you influence others? How do you show up in the boardroom? You may not have been in a board, before. You might have been in a nonprofit board. Those could be references. You could have, these are the things, it's not just execution. And then finally, again, we can talk about this, is your story. And this is, quite simply, know thyself. The biggest quote that I would offer, or perspective I would offer on this, is a CV is a chronological description of your career path, right? It's like from 1997 to 2005, from 2005 to 2010. It just literally, where was I when it was, right? A board bio is different. It is more thematically you, right? So let's get back to that. What are the themes of you? That's what your story is. Because the chronology doesn't matter. That's not what we're solving for. In 1997, that's not the point. The point is that there might be themes. So maybe there was 3 arcs. I was a technical person, and then I learned go to market, and then I, tested my CEO chops. That might be kind of a way of describing your arc. Or it could say, I've worked really effectively to complement founders on achieving their missions. That would be another theme, regardless of what industries you are actually playing in. So there's toolkits around how to develop a board bio. It's not as much of like what you put on paper It's the exercise that you force yourself to go through to say, what are my themes and how is that applicable to a board setting? So questions you might ask yourself, you know, where did I drive, influence for impact? Where did I express courage in my career? How have I consistently, what are the themes and patterns by which I've made decisions? A la what motivates me. Maybe I keep ending up in very different industries, but they're all mission oriented, right? They all tie to a societal agenda. These are the things that you'll be asking yourself. And when you're building your board bio, the other thing that's helpful about it, in addition to developing your kind of narrative of thematic view of you, is you're by definition having to exercise a higher altitude to derive at those themes. So you're kind of looking at yourself up here and being like, like extrapolation from the CV and what I did in 1997 or 2005. What threads and themes am I seeing? All right, Sam, you're on.
Yeah. So what do you see as people's biggest challenge with getting through the board bio process? Is it lack of self-reflection? Is it overstating capabilities? What's the thing that you're like, that board bio really doesn't meet the bar, right? Similar to how we look at resumes and they're not very strong. Just love your perspective on how you think about a board bio.
It's a great question. I would say people are too tactical versus thematic. So that would be my biggest push. I would secondly offer, people are of course so close to the companies that they have served, but they might forget to describe it. So for example, you guys may or may not know the company Process. Huge business, owns a whole portfolio of consumer internet assets around the globe, largely in emerging markets. I know it, I've done board work for them, but many people don't, including on today's call. And so I was coaching someone and said, you need to put this into context. It's huge business. It's incredibly global. And so again, sometimes you just need to articulate what that company was, particularly at the time you were there, right? So if you take Yahoo, for example, like how many people do we all know that were at Yahoo? Well, if you were there in like 2002 versus 2006 versus today, they're very different businesses with incredibly different challenges. So it's both kind of taking a blurb to describe the business, as well as maybe the context of it. So for example, if you were at Yahoo today, you would say, this is an Apollo-backed, this is a private equity-backed effective turnaround that brings critical assets to domains and because they've got sports and, finance, and those are like badass assets, right? So you'd have to like articulate that because it's not what it was in 2005 as a public company that was, starting to kind of lose its momentum, right? So I don't know if those are two things I would advise on. The one other small tip that I would offer, so thank you, Sam, is don't forget to mention your passions. I don't need to know everything, right, about your personal endeavors, nor do boards, but it is true, going back to the notion that we all have kind of negative discretionary time with a lot of demands on it. We love finding people who can bring their talents to boards that align with some personal interest, right? So, if we are doing work for the On sneakers, right? The On board, you might think of someone who not just has had an experience in footwear apparel, but maybe is a marathoner, or maybe, has some kind of alignment with that mission. We placed a woman who Egon Zehnder had known had uterine cancer at a very, very young age. I'm talking high school, and she's now, 50-year-old. We have placed her on an oncology kind of therapeutics board because we had that information, which obviously is very private, HIPAA protected piece of information. But she'd shared that story with us, and it helped us say, oh my gosh, they need an exceptional technologist. And, this would basically captivate your give back, give forward need as a human in a very special way. So my third point, again, altitude and thematic. 2, make sure you explain the context of and the company that you're associated with. And then third, make sure you do include some blurbs related to things that might be uniquely captivating or special about you.
And Lindsay, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question of like, is the story any different than what you would share as an executive interviewing for a company? Like, is it pretty much similar, or are there nuanced differences?
It's a great question. It's a variation, but what came to mind is in a board matter, in an executive matter, it's what I did and how I did it. In a board, it's what I did and how I did it, right? I think the how, right, and the context and is going to maybe be of higher importance. Because is it 17 million to 25 million EBITDA? Does it matter if it's 17 to 25? No, but there are kind of contours of what you did. So again, I think that there's a leveling. The other thing that this reminds me of, which is super critical, is when you, and this again is going to sound like apple pie, but I've had to learn this and learn this again. Do your homework. There is no such thing as an introductory meeting on a board opportunity that's not a real interview where they're not looking for you to do your homework. And if there's someone like myself in the process, we can supply you with certain information, analyst reports, etc. Certainly at public companies, there's a ton in the public domain, filings, etc. But they will expect you to have done the work. So showing up, my clients will ding someone who they were super excited about on paper, who references really well, if they show up and they ask really suboptimal questions. And by suboptimal, I mean asking, okay, well, tell me more about the business. Like, that's not a question. Another question is, I noticed that you guys are 80% in the domestic market. How do you think about international expansion as part of your arc going forward? Right? That shows I did my research, and I have a question about it. So what is it demonstrating? I can't speak. It's showing your motivation. If you cared, you would have done the work. And it's showing how you might show up in the boardroom. And they don't want someone to show up in the boardroom and not have done their homework, because they sometimes will send out, 80-page pre-reads for which they're expecting you to then come into the dialogue of conversation around. So you don't want to show up and say, hey, I don't do my homework.
Thank you.
What other questions are top of mind?
So I put them in the chat, but I was curious about what are your thoughts on being a board observer? And I'm thinking particularly for like earlier stage startups to kind of get your foot into the door on board service.
Great question. I think being a board observer helps educate you on what board dynamics are. Being a board observer, the difference is you don't have fiduciary duty, right? So the way you kind of may show up may be informed by that, right? So like, it's not all on you, right? How would I compare this? I would compare this to like an interim CEO. Sometimes when I have interim CEOs, like, they're not really in it to gut in, right? Because they feel like their psychology and identity is a little bit like, I'm a rented interim, right? So again, you may not be able to practice in that role, kind of how you might otherwise show up, but it would still be educational to see how the boardroom works. And almost, I would argue, like, play an anthropology hat and also look around the room and say, how do I observe folks behaving, and what would I like to learn from or pass on, right? What would I like to consider a role model versus not? So I would say that it'll help shape your ability to serve well on a board, but it doesn't necessarily make you eligible.
Okay. And kind of a sort of related question. So I'm on the board of trustees for like a school, right?
Yeah.
Like a nonprofit school. Is there a way to kind of parlay like nonprofit experience into corporate board service? Obviously it's different, but
Yeah.
I operate as a fiduciary. We're thinking about 20 to 30 years out, not the day-to-day operations of the school. So
yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very common question. So let me answer it. There's kind of three parts. One is, it officially doesn't make you eligible to serve on like a for-profit board because the standards, expectations are going to be different. Yet there are two reasons why serving on nonprofit, aside from the goodness that it provides the universe, why it can help you. One is your ability to articulate, just as you did, I'm serving as a fiduciary. I'm having to, not sit in the day-to-day, but balance that with a longer term view, as well as there might be experiences in your nonprofit board service that lend it to kind of what you might do in a other board setting. So for example, you could say, we needed to hire a new executive director, right? Or we needed to pivot our strategy because, we used to have federal funding and now we don't, whatever it is. So you could talk about how you played a strategic role as a fiduciary and bring that to life, right? The second thing that can be of value, again, so the first one is like, it doesn't necessarily make you eligible, but the two pros being kind of what you practice in that and how you translate that story. And then, again, the final one being, the network. So the network of many of these nonprofits can be very rich and accretive connections that help you, kind of navigate their networks. And they also can be references for you. So for example, if you're an operating executive and you're not going to have as much quote unquote board exposure, them serving as a reference, and they could say, oh my gosh, it's like, he is the person who can drive, cohesion in a group on a very contentious issue. And he's the only one in the room who can do it, whatever they are referencing. But those are really valuable voices and connections that you can lean into. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yep.
that's really helpful. Thanks.
So it's a no but. All right. Joe, we want to know what your real background is. Not that I wish I was in Hawaii once.
Yeah, I'm on the northeast side of Florida here in Jacksonville.
Okay, great.
So I got kind of a question, kind of building off of the nonprofit boards. So I've been on QSO boards in the credit union space. So it's kind of like the sub company to the parent. And so I guess one, like how to position those, relative to kind of open board roles, and then kind of translating it into how to really kind of stand out to be in the conversation to say you want to step into a board role and kind of really stand out to someone like yourself.
Yeah, no, it's great. First of all, if no one here is familiar with credit union business model or community banks, they are impressive and play a very critical role in our economy. So kudos to you. I've done work on the BECU board, which is the one up in Washington State or more broadly, and including placing their CEO. So awesome, kudos. For folks who don't know credit unions and community banks, it does need to be translated, right? So as I was just saying, you might have to describe if, you're at Yahoo today or in 2005 or whatever. Similarly, like a credit union business model is not as known to everyone. And also oftentimes their AUM can be like mind-blowing and impressive, but you would, respectfully, Joe, kind of it mightn't be discounted, right? Because it's, again, just less familiar. So again, it would be on you to say, this is, a X AUM community bank that has endeavored to or is leading in X dimension or serving a certain community, right? Sometimes they are serving a certain community. I'm a USAA member. And, that also can tap into kind of where you show kind of care. So it can also represent for you that you are aligned to mission-oriented businesses, right? Which are, kind of double bottom line or, again, not just in the pursuit of using fees to pillage, consumers and deliver shareholder returns. So I would use it in a variety of ways, but unfortunately, as is true for many businesses, if it's not a marquee, top brand, you do have to kind of explain it. And again, make sure it's expressed appropriately to align with what your motivations may be. Secondly, it is true that board searches are both, solved by word of mouth and networking, as well as through people like me. So it is definitely important to get to know kind of recruiters who do the space. And it is also important to network. And going back to how a nonprofit board or a community bank board can serve you, you can also tell them, because they will presumably be your advocates if you're serving that position well, say, this is my interest. I want to serve on a board such as this. It is not very helpful to say, I want to serve on a board. Okay, so I will tell you, I'll save you guys all $150,000. I went to an expensive business school and I remember very few things, but one thing that they taught me is if you say, name everything in the refrigerator in the next 60 seconds, your list is kind of short. If you say, name all the white things in a refrigerator in 60 seconds, your list is very long. It's ironic because you actually made a smaller ask because you're asking for only white things, but it triggers the brain more productively. And so your list is longer. Therefore, don't tell your friends and your colleagues that you want to be on a board. say you want to be on an X or Y board, and it will help them be more productive in advising you or connecting dots that are going to be most productive for you. So again, it's your personal network and getting out in the universe, and it's not ostentatious or unbecoming, to put this out in the universe. So don't be afraid that it misrepresents your humility. And I think also as you do network for opportunities, both with folks like myself and others, be patient with it. I have board projects right now that will be 24-month engagements. So, I kind of know what we're solving for, in 2027, as well as what we're solving for today. Does that help, Joe? Aram, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes.
Great. Good to hear.
I wanted to ask your opinion on just someone, let's say your first time board member. How would you characterize the difference between a public and a non-public board, and then maybe even a small to medium-sized board, and as that scales up until you hit, I mean, these days you don't need to be public to be enormous. So, and how the contours of that change because of like the sophistication. Specifically, if you're on a smaller board, maybe you're not coming up against, public affairs or governmental affairs. As when you get to scale, your limiting growth factor is actually policy or a regional issue or taxation policies or things like that.
Yep. No, great question. So there's two questions therein. So I'll first answer the private versus public. They're quite different, right? And even in the private domain, there could be venture-backed, private equity-backed, family-owned. I mean, there is a spectrum there. And then there's kind of public. And then, by the way, they can be newly public. They can be long public. They can be on the US exchanges. They can be on the Lithuanian exchange. I mean, we've seen it all, right? So there is a spectrum even when they're in. Venture-backed boards typically do not bring independent directors in until they're truly in that kind of pre-IPO window. You might be a board advisor. You could be an independent director. I advocate for that, but those seats are rarely used in that way. You would probably not hold a lot of power, but you would have influence, right? So you would, even if you had an independent director seat, you would probably feel more like an advisor than a proper fiduciary. And that's because the power would still, fundamentally be held in the founder hands or the venture hands. So just kind of knowing that, I guess, is like sets the stage of kind of how your role may manifest. Private equity boards, oftentimes they'll put friends and family. Private equity will. Some private equity firms will believe in actually bringing in independent, which is, by the way, like lowercase I independent, because the PE firms bring them in, and therefore vetting them. So again, you would have more of an advisory role than an authoritative role. And then family-owned businesses are the similar way. So in private companies, again, your role is to influence and drive great outcomes, but it wouldn't necessarily kind of have the same fiduciary responsibility and or authority as a public company. Additionally, tricky with private company boards, they can be absorbing, right? Because oftentimes private companies will bring on folks onto the board where they have a functional gap or a knowledge gap, right? So they're trying to enter Latin America. Okay, great. So you led businesses all in Brazil and, whatever countries. It kind of starts to borderline a little bit of like executive meets board. So you might need to be explicit around kind of what is a limit to your capacity. So in extreme cases, there was a early stage growth company and they wanted to add a CMO to their board. Clearly they had marketing limitations. And we said, okay, this is X number of, they're going to be monthly meetings. There's more meetings, of course, in a private company. They're going to be monthly meetings. Anything that exceeds, monthly meetings plus an extra amount, then there would be a billable rate. And that person was just trying to constrain being taken advantage of or limit that. And then on public companies, again, it depends on whether you're newly public. It depends on whether you have an activist or whether you kind of have been public for a long period of time and are huge. If you're a huge public company board, you're right. It's like litigation. I have a friend who used to serve on one of the big, top 5 tech companies globally. And, a lot of it is regulatory affairs. And so the nature of that responsibility just has it just shapes differently. Again, looking for activism is an important thing, right? Because that shapes kind of what that board experience would be. And emotionally, that can be quite draining, and it can also be time intensive. So, again, there's lots of different answers, but I think to your question, it is not one size fits all, and these are the types of questions you can bring to diligence your opportunities.
Thank you for that. And like your story, your comment about the CV versus your board profile and your arc. When you think about that for public versus private, and then the different sizes, do you approach that differently too, based on what you just said? I think is there some sort of guideline or blueprint that you can suggest or point us to in terms of thinking about what type of company or size or so forth that be more appropriate?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think whenever you're thinking about a board, you would want to say, how can, is this a place where I can contribute and like be proud and accretive to the conversation? And then, also what can I learn, right? And kind of any relationship is going to have that give or take. And those are fine conversations to have in interviews too, because other directors will kind of expect that of you, that they want you to learn and they want you to contribute. So that would be the lens. And then, again, whether it's, big or small, it certainly varies. I mean, when Cheryl was rolling off the Starbucks board, she made a referral in her network to someone who was very brilliant, but was also very young and arguably a subscale entrepreneur, relative to the stature and scale of Starbucks. And that's not a judgment statement, but again, it allows me to draw witness to, it's not, just because you're a big company person, you get on big company boards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I'm working on a $1.5 billion public company performing well. And we're looking for folks who are, next level, right? Or, if you look at a CEO that you would know, he's leading a $10 billion public company. He wants to be on companies that are 20, 30 billion, not because he's an egomaniac, because he wants to learn about the frontier ahead,
Mm-hmm.
So again, I would look at your opportunities as it relates to where do I learn, how do I learn, and how do I contribute?
Great. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take this opportunity just to throw up the QR code. We'll take a couple more questions, but as you know, we love to collect feedback at Sidebar. Please do take out your phone camera and point it to the QR code, and it will take you less than 2 minutes, I promise, to fill out the survey form. And we always share feedback back with our speakers, and I know Lindsay would greatly appreciate the feedback. So let's take a few more questions while I keep the slide up. So I see, I see a couple of hands, but Christine, I know you threw up a question in chat. I don't know if you want to be brave enough to get off mute and ask directly. Otherwise, I could ask it for you.
Yeah, I think that I thought it was addressed. So thank you, first of all, for sharing with us today. But yeah, what I heard was that there is networking, and we need to like use our network to get to folks like Lindsay and or direct referrals.
Absolutely. And by the way, it's always good to network in general. You never know what you'll learn or where you'll end up.
And Christine is on the Women in Product Board with me and Deb, Lindsay. So, Sam, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Lindsay, one follow-up. When we think about successful first-time board members, they do really good things.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that they don't do right?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So let me start with like what's good, right? So you might ask for, can I have a board buddy? And that sounds super trite and first grade-ish, but it just really means that there's an accountable party to like answer kind of the random questions that you might have, and someone's kind of looking out for your kind of success in onboarding. That's a great thing to ask for. It's often done. It's often intended, but not done. So there's a variance there. You would also want to make sure that as you are onboarding that you ask for prior material, because what you don't want to do, going back to your question, is waste people's time in board meetings because you're the new guy. And it's not because you're not smart, you just don't have the contextual knowledge of yesterday and yesteryear. So I would put it upon you to like do the homework and ask and say, hey, can I get the last few quarters board materials, and kind of submerge yourself in that, right? Similarly, you would spend time with your board buddy before your first board meeting and be like, what's hot, what's not, you know, who plays the role of talk too much, who plays the role of like the wise guy. You know, you can ask these questions that help you navigate the dynamics in a room. And then again, I would say, is your punctuation a question mark? Yes. Ask the question. And then know your altitude. Talk less, not more. Ask for feedback. Good? Awesome.
Ida, I know, Sam, you also had your hand up, but I know, want to make sure that we get some more voices in. Ida, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, my connection isn't very stable, but I'm wondering what secrets can you tell us? Like I've known the basics of getting a board position. We've had some great talks at Sidebar about a board profile and where to put that, and a little bit about how to be discovered, but it just seems like it's only ever who you know. So how do you find people you don't know? Do you look for people you don't know? And are there prerequisites like had to work at Google, had to have some, right, some previous board experience, had like, I want to know what the secrets are.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I don't know if there's really secrets, but I would say that I call people every week who I don't know. I literally cold call people. Hi, I'm Lindsay.
And how do you pick them?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I just want that to be known, right? It's not literally just the list of who I know. And then secondly, it's driven by a search strategy, right? So a search strategy is basically a response to what the client needs kind of at that time. And I can oftentimes be running two search strategies in one, which I'll get to, which goes back to that longer term thinking. I'll give you an example because this is a true client meeting I had this morning. Public company, growth company. Originally, we were going to hire a CEO, former or current, who'd experienced the same kind of scale curve, right? Ideally with consumer, right? Because they needed to understand unit economics. Ideally with experience going from a mono to a multi-product line. That's the spec. What I told the head of NomGov, the CEO, and another NomGov committee member this morning, I said, I just want to play back what I'm observing. This is where we started. We've also thought about COOs, those operator types who have done the scaling, but not in the CEO capacity. You're passing on those. Again, this is me bringing the altitude. I'm observing here. I'm not judging. I'm just playing the script. And you're really leaning into people who are actually not been CEOs. And if they had, that was like for a hot minute because they're CTOs, more technical profiles, right? And so I was just laying that out. So we started here and we ended up here, A, because they're learning, and B, because they're understanding how their evolving needs. And so I am researching, quite literally, folks who would bring, and so I introduced two people. One person I know, one person I didn't know at all. Like, I mean, I knew of the company, but I didn't know the human. I introduced those two people. And, you know, we're effectively calibrating and redesigning our search strategy accordingly. So my homework now is to take those mental metaphors and say, who else should you meet? Who else is going to bring kind of the right altitude for the boardroom, who has been, you know, been a CTO, who would understand, you know, some of the kind of global scaling challenges, unit economic considerations, kind of mono to multi-product line that they face. So again, that's one example, but, you know, it does show that there's, you know, a learning journey. It's dynamic process, and that there is a research where I might have an idea because I met someone yesterday, or it might be that, you know, my compute basically says I should meet someone and approach them and get to know them in the context. And it is true, going back to that initial kind of circle, the culture fit is a big part of it, right? So even if I think about just this example, you know, mercurial is great, no problem, right? We talk about the spectrum of mercurial. I mean, how funny is that, right? Authenticity is critical, you know? Achievement with humility must be, intellectual velocity must be. And so I'm sensing these candidates, not just evaluating them on paper, because that is the culture of the board and the expectation of someone and how they will contribute and manifest in that room.
Lindsay, thank you so much. I want to be respectful of your time because I'm confident that you have a 1 o'clock and I do not want to make you late for it. However, I do want to just, for the folks who stayed till the very end, how receptive are you to having folks reach out to you?
For sure, for sure. I mean, I have a little bit of summer vacation, as we all probably do, but certainly feel free to ping me a note and just also mention in there the
is
context.
best, or is there another way to contact you?
Email's best. I'm going to put it in the chat.
Okay.
And I put in this board bio thing too, in case it's helpful. Yeah, as a tool.
Super
Well,
helpful.
thank you
Thanks.
so much for spending the hour with us. It was nuggets of wisdom after wisdom after wisdom, and we're so grateful that you spent your time with us. And we will be in touch. Thank you again, Lindsay.
Thank you all. All right, enjoy your day.
Take care. Bye.